Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. Secretary Jacobson, before I get to my questions, I wanted to ask, you discussed that we are in these discussions with the Cubans and we have distinct views on human rights, and I don't mean to say that this is what you meant, but let's just be clear. These are not two distinct views that are both legitimate. This is a view of human rights that we have and a view of human rights they have, which under no circumstances fits under any definition of human rights. Their views on human rights are not legitimate, they're immoral. The notion that you round up people and arrest them because they disagree with the government, the theory that you can send thugs to Panama to beat up on democracy activists. I mean, you would say this up front, right? That their view of human rights isn't just different from ours, they are flat out wrong and immoral in their views.
We have said clearly that we don't think those views accord with international standards and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So the Cubans are flat out wrong when it comes to human rights?
On repressing people's rights to free speech and assembly, we do not think they're correct. Yes.
There's no moral equivalence between our view of human rights and theirs?
I didn't say that, and I would not, that's not what I was trying to say.
All right, good. I wanted to get that clear. Let me talk about travel. It's a big part of what everyone's talking about. The truth is, and I'm going from Hotel Magazine, Hotel Magazine wrote a few years ago that Gaviota, S.A., which is owned by the Cuban military and is a prominent subsidiary of Grupo Gaesa, which is the holding company that basically controls the entire Cuban economy. It's also the largest hotel conglomerate in Latin America and the Caribbean. It has hotel holdings equivalent to the Walt Disney Company's hotel holdings. And it's run by General Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Callejas. That's a long name. He's Raul Castro's son-in-law. Let me read you something that McClatchy newspapers wrote a few years ago about this network. It wrote, quote, "Tourists who sleep in some of Cuba's hotels, drive rental cars, fill up their gas tanks, and even those riding in taxis have something in common. They are contributing to the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces bottom line," end quote. In essence, recognizing that if you travel to Cuba, if you stay in a Cuban hotel, in all likelihood you're staying in a hotel run by the Cuban military. If you rent a car, you're renting it from the Cuban military. If you fill up your gas tank, you're filling up from the Cuban military. And I would add that if you stay at a hotel, you are staying in all likelihood in a confiscated property, a land that was taken from a previous private owner who was never compensated for it. In essence, when you travel to Cuba and stay in one of these hotels, not only are you putting money in the hands of the Cuban government, you're trafficking in stolen goods because it is a property that belonged to a private holder, some of American citizens, who were never compensated for it. So when we talk about increased travel to Cuba and more commerce with Cuba through travel, what we're really talking about is increased business ties with the Cuban military for the most part. Is that not an accurate assessment at this time?
It is certainly accurate that the Cuban state, including the military, runs many of those, a large percentage of the hotels and other infrastructure. We also now have an increasing number of casas particulares, people's individual homes, which are being used as hotels or B&Bs, Airbnb working on that, and private entrepreneurs moving into spaces to support the purposeful travel.
So then why wouldn't we limit our opening and travel to say if you travel to Cuba, you can only stay at one of these casas particulares or one of these other non-governmental, non-military owned facilities? Why wouldn't we, as part of our opening, say you can travel to Cuba, but you cannot stay in a property that was stolen, and you cannot stay in a property owned or operated by the Cuban government, which includes even the foreign flagged hotels, because they have majority ownership there as well?
Senator, our strong belief is, though, we are aware that there will be some financial benefit to the Cuban government by the larger number of Americans going to Cuba. The benefit of those larger numbers, which could not be supported only by individual homes, for example, the benefit to the Cuban people of this larger number of Americans going far outweighs the increased in economic benefit that may accrue to the Cuban government.
So just to understand clearly, and bottom line is you agree that if you travel to Cuba, you are staying in all likelihood in a stolen property that is in all likelihood run by the Cuban government. But that said, the fact that there's going to be Americans present there outweighs, the benefit of having Americans being able to travel and interact with Cuba outweighs the economic benefits that are going directly to the Cuban military.
I would say that it's possible those properties are confiscated. It's certainly the case that many of the properties are state-owned, but we do believe that the benefit outweighs.
Which property, other than those private homes that you've talked about, which are also largely state-owned as well, but at least an individual is running it. Other than the private homes, which is still a very small sector of their economy, which Cuban hotel is not owned or operated? Which Cuban hotel is not owned by the Cuban government?
Well, I said that I assume that most of them are state-run, especially because the joint ventures, even joint ventures, are majority
So then all of them
Cuban.
are state-run. Is there a private-owned hotel in Cuba?
I don't know, sir, but I assume that there are none. But there are, as I say, these bed and breakfasts and individual homes.
Right.
But again, I think the premise on which we're basing this is that the benefits of engagement, purposeful travel, are very, very great to the Cuban people and seen overwhelmingly by the Cuban people as of benefit to them, as surveys show.
Well, you also I want to talk about the Internet for a moment. Cubans, as you said, have blamed the U.S. for lack of access to the Internet and so forth. It's been couched as a lack of capacity. In fact, the Cubans don't only say it, our own president has said that. Quote, he said, "Unfortunately, our sanctions on Cuba have denied Cubans access to technology that has empowered individuals around the world," end quote. But I think you know that that's not true. For example, there is no Japanese embargo on Cuba. There is no South Korean embargo on Cuba. And yet those technologies are not widely available either. Is it not true that at the end of the day, access to Internet in Cuba is not simply a function of capacity, because there are multiple other countries around the world that do not have an embargo on Cuba that can provide cell technology or Internet technology? Is it not true that the vast majority of the impediment to access to the Internet and technology in Cuba is as a result of Cuban government censorship?
I think the denial of access has been both one of policy and one of, in terms of American, access to American products, also one of policy of the United States. We're taking one of those two things away. They are now able to have access to U.S. products, which we always believe are the best in the world, and that leaves only policy.
I understand, but there are still other countries. I have a Samsung. Why isn't Cuba awash in Samsungs? Why isn't all these other countries around the world that don't have an embargo on Cuba, why haven't they been allowed to come in and offer Wi-Fi and all the sorts of things that developed countries have? In essence, it's not a capacity issue. The reason why people in Cuba don't have access to the Internet ultimately is because the Cuban government won't allow it.
Well, there is a question of infrastructure that needs to be present to utilize the
But other countries could have provided that.
They could have.
The
And
Cubans
so
didn't allow
policy
it.
is clearly a big part of this, and we don't know whether that policy will change. They have said they want to modernize their telecommunications sector.
So why didn't they do it with the Japanese, the Koreans, the Germans, or any other number of countries around the world that have Internet and technology capabilities outside of U.S. capabilities?
I'm hoping they want our stuff.
No, I understand.
And we will be able to compete well, but we also see on the island many Samsung phones, many other cell phone technology of the latest make, but it's not connected to anything yet.
Well, it's connected to the Cuban government Internet telecommunications.
And that will be the question. Can they open to something that allows their economic development to enter the modern world and connect Cubans to the world?
Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Just a couple points I wanted to touch on. This Internet thing's important. I've talked about it extensively in the past. As I listen to some of this conversation, I think there's still this perception that somehow the reason why there's no Internet infrastructure in Cuba is because the U.S. hasn't gone in to build it. The Cuban government had a joint venture with an Italian company for many years. By the way, the telecom industry in Cuba is run by the Cuban government, and it's a holding held by Gaesa, the holding company run by the son-in-law of Raul Castro. The bottom line is virtually every telecom company in the world, and there are dozens of advanced telecom companies in the world that are not within the territory of the United States, have had access to the Cuban market, and they have not been allowed to build out or have dropped out of joint ventures. The bottom line is that the fact that American infrastructure will be allowed to come in does not mean the Cubans will allow it, and here's why. They don't want the Cuban people to have access to the Internet. In China, they have something called the Great Firewall. They have access to Internet in China. There's all sorts of infrastructure. China has both nationally owned and private companies within China that offer telecommunication infrastructure, and yet the people of China do not have access to the Internet the way you and I understand it because the government places filters upon it. This is a government that won't even allow you to bring in certain books onto the island. This is a government that won't even allow you to read certain newspapers on the island. This idea that they are going to somehow allow AT&T and Verizon to say, yes, come in and build all this infrastructure, unfettered access to the Cuban people, is absurd. They cannot survive an internet opening. And so we can pass all the laws we want. The Cuban government is still going to place filters, and you still have to work through their telecommunications company in a joint venture in order to build infrastructure on the island. As far as the travel is concerned, I think it's, Airbnb, that's fantastic, right? That they're all building this up. Well, here's the point. Number one is even private operators on the island of Cuba, bed and breakfast, casas particulares, whatever you want to call them, still pay an exorbitant fee to the government for the right to be able to provide that service. So they even game that system to get their hands on money. That being said, the vast majority of people that travel to Cuba will not be staying at one of these facilities. They will be staying at segregated tourist destinations where tourists are largely brought in, they experience that facility, and then they leave. And the money's going to the Cuban military. And I've heard discussion about Vietnam and China. Look, we have full travel to China and Vietnam. We have business with them. They're not any more democratic than they were when all this started. So I think it actually proves my point that economic openings do not lead to political openings by evidence of China and Vietnam. But here's my point about the Cuban military. In addition to the fact that the Castro regime stole 6,000 properties owned by U.S. citizens or U.S. companies, of which $0 have been compensated, this is the Cuban military that has three senior officials indicted for the murder of 4 Floridians, indicted in U.S. courts. That's the Cuban military. This is the Cuban military that was helping smuggle heavy weapons to North Korea without consequence. They were caught, no UN sanctions, no U.S. sanctions. This is not just a Cuban military. This is a Cuban military that uses access to funds to carry out this sort of grotesque activity. And so when we talk about travel to Cuba, business with Cuba, let's be very clear. We're not doing business with the Cuban people. You may eat at a home somewhere. This is still a very small part of their economy. For the vast and enormous majority of Americans that travel there, and that includes congressional codels, journalists, diplomats, and everyday American citizens, you will stay in a government-run facility. Every dollar you spend there will wind up in the hands of the Cuban military that sponsors terrorism by smuggling arms to North Korea, that has senior officials indicted for the murder of Americans over international airspace, and a Cuban military that uses every access it has to funds to enrich themselves and repress the Cuban people. And so there is no economic opening to Cuba. There is an economic opening to Gaesa, which is the Cuban military-run holding company.